Hey everybody, it's Charles from HumbleMechanic.com. Today, I'm going to give you some tips on installing coilovers on your car. When we think about upgrading our suspension, doing coilovers is a really great option. Not only can you get a set with great ride quality, but you also get that full adjustability that so many of us want. And since the GTI is getting coilovers, I thought this would be a great opportunity to share some tips with you guys for installing coilovers on any car. Now, most of this also would apply if you're replacing the suspension with factory components or with any kind of aftermarket spring shock absorber setup. So here are 5 tips for installing coilovers. Number 1 is use proper tools. Now, most of this job can actually be done with hand tools and probably should. It's not recommended to use impact tools on the assembly side of a shock absorber. It can actually spin that internal housing and cause damage to the valving inside. But since we're going to be replacing the shock absorbers on the car, using an impact tool coming apart is really not that big of a deal. These are just going to get recycled anyway. And with 140,000 miles on the original shock absorbers, it's time for a new set. But if you're installing coilovers on a newer car, or might put the factory suspension back on it, you really don't want to use an impact gun here. Also remember to get out your torque wrench when putting it back together. Proper torque is very important. Not properly torquing the fasteners can change the load on the bushings and bearings, and this can cause anything from noise, premature wear, or even ride quality issues. Unless otherwise noted in your coilover kit, it's a good idea to follow the manufacturer's recommended torque sequence and torque specification. Some suspension components do require the car to be on the ground in the fully loaded position before bolts are properly torqued. Also, some may require a special tool to remove or install the shock absorber. They make special sockets that allow you to counterhold the top of the shock absorber while tightening it down. For this job, I'll be honest, I cheated a little bit and used an oxygen sensor socket. That being said, it would have been easier if I had the right tool. I'll put a link down in the description to a couple of the tools you can check out for doing this job. Number 2 is to replace bushings and bearings. We're going to be taking a lot of the suspension apart, so this is a great time to replace things like strut bushings, strut bearings, control arm bushings, sway bar bushings, or even ball joints. On this car, because I had so much of the lower suspension out already, all of those things got replaced before doing the coilovers. Now, I like to use poly bushings a lot. With proper lubrication and proper installation, they generally don't make any noise. But if you simply want to replace them with the factory bushings, that's cool too. The need to replace bushings really does depend on the mileage on your car. We're at about 140,000 miles on this car, so it was the perfect opportunity to get everything new and refreshed. On a car that's newer, you may not need to replace all these parts, but it's something worth considering because you're going to have things apart and you're going to need an alignment anyway, which we'll get to in a minute. But this can save you a bit of money later on by only having to get it aligned one time. This one's kind of 2.5. It's also actually a good idea to replace the bolt that you're going to be taking out. Many suspension bolts are torque to yield, so those have to be replaced when you take them out anyway. But odds are on older cars, you may be dealing with bolts that are oxidized, stretched, worn a little bit, so this is a perfect opportunity to spend a couple extra dollars and get some new hardware. Here you see this is a strut bushing and a strut bearing. These components have a pretty high failure rate, not only on this generation Volkswagen, but a lot of other ones going forward. So doing the bearings, I think, is almost a must. Ultimately, do a proper inspection on your suspension before putting your coilovers on and decide how deep you want to go into replacing bushings, bearings, and hardware. Number 3 is maintenance. Yes, like so many other things, coilovers require maintenance. This maintenance actually does start on installation. Many coilover manufacturers call for putting anti-seize or other products on the body of the shock absorber to help prevent corrosion. And whenever you decide it's time to adjust that suspension, it's a good idea to go ahead and clean it off and reapply it. Now, as you can see here, I'm using just plain old anti-seize, which works okay. There are some concerns of it building up dirt and debris, but if we're maintaining our coilovers, it's not too big of a deal. I've also stumbled into a product called Bow Shield, which I've never used, but comes highly recommended from a lot of coilover manufacturers. I'll be sure to put a link to both of these products down in the description, but more importantly, whatever you use, be sure to clean the threads and reapply it as needed or whenever you make an adjustment. This can really help from a bad time of dealing with corroded, frozen, or seized coilover components. Number 4 is making good adjustments. Look, this is the beauty of having coilovers on your car. We get this full adjustability, some more than others, but this can also be a stress point for some folks, so it's important to take good measurements. Setting that ride height accurately is incredibly important, whether we're doing this for looks or performance reasons, we don't want to upset the balance of the car. So taking good before and after measurements is incredibly important. I like to get a baseline measurement before making any changes to the suspension. And we probably want to know how much lower our car is. And you won't be able to know that for sure without taking a before measurement. Of course, we make the after measurement to be sure that all of our corners are lowered evenly. And we use that to compare it to the before measurement so we know just how much we brought our car down. So how do we measure? Well, on our before measurement, the best way to do it is to remove the center cap from the wheel and take your measurement from the center of the wheel to the fender. The other option that I really like, if your wheel allows it, is to use the lip of the wheel and make that same measurement. Doing it from the center of the wheel can provide a better fixed point than the wheel, but it can be a bit harder to make that measurement. After installing our coilovers, we want to find that exact spot and take the same measurement. This is what we're going to use to compare to see how low we went. But those aren't the only measurements we're going to make. After you have your coilovers installed, it's best to find a fixed point on the car and take your measurement there. On the rear, you can see we're using the axle beam mounting position to make our measurements. We're measuring it from the axle to the bottom of the spindle piece on the coilover. And we'll use this to measure left and right to make sure that our numbers are the same. You'll also want to find that same fixed point in the front of the vehicle. This can be the center of the mounting point for the shock absorber, or really anywhere that's fixed. You can also use kind of a rough measurement of counting the threads from the first thread at the bottom of the body of the shock absorber up to the adjustment spindle of the shock absorber. This works really well too to get it close, but I like to put a tape measure on it and get it a little more precise. You will also want to lower the car down, roll it back and forth a few times, and let it settle out a little bit before taking these measurements. It's important to remember too that your suspension will most likely settle a bit, sometimes 5 to 10 millimeters or 0.2 to about half an inch. So after a week or two or some mild driving, you may want to bring it back in and take your measurements again to see if your suspension has settled. This is another reason why we may want to set the suspension a little bit higher than our end goal is going to be. We can always bring it back down more after the suspension has settled out. And finally, number 5 might just be one of the most important tips altogether, and that is get your car properly, keyword properly aligned, and any other adjustments that may be needed. You have totally upset the suspension geometry of the car by lowering it. It was not designed to be at the ride height that you put it at. So it's time to get all those adjustments back into specification. And it's actually more than simply maybe having the steering wheel off. It can cause poor tire wear, and really something that I experienced right away is very poor traction and handling. There are multiple ways to do the alignment. You can get it pretty darn close with a string alignment, but I highly recommend take it to a good shop and get a proper alignment done. This is most likely going to be more than just a front toe and go type alignment. Take it to a place that specializes in performance suspensions and get it done right. You may also want to consider having it corner balanced as well, just to make sure the car is set up properly. Some of this does depend on what your goals are for the car. If there's going to be any track involved or autocrossing, rallycross, this is a must. If you just want to slam it on the ground and look cool, it's not as important because you're probably going to have a car that doesn't ride great and you're going to be burning through tires anyway. But no matter what, I highly recommend get a proper alignment done. There are also a couple other adjustments that you really want to make sure that get made after lowering your car. Things like checking your headlight aim, your brake bias. If you have driver assist systems like adaptive cruise control, lane departure warning, collision avoidance, you really need to get those relearned and reset as well. They may eventually learn themselves, but that's something you want to keep in mind before you lower your car. You also want to check and make sure your clearances are good. Your wheel and tire assemblies not hitting this new coilover that you just installed. The brake lines aren't rubbing, and the wires for the speed sensors aren't having a space conflict. So those are a few things that I think you really do need to follow to properly install coilovers on your car. I'd like to thank NGP New German Performance for supplying me with these coilovers. Guys, these coilovers ride so good. I could not be happier with how great this car really does ride. And let's face it, it looks 100 times cooler on these Audi Fat 5s lowered than it did before. If you guys have any questions, comments, or tips you'd like to share, drop that down below. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, hit the share button. Don't forget to subscribe and ding that notification bell. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course on Snapchat. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.